October 2nd, 2018. Carrollton, Texas. At 9:17 in the morning, co-workers rushed out of the Green Tree Apartments office after hearing what sounded like gunshots in the parking lot. What they found would turn an ordinary Tuesday morning into a full-scale homicide investigation. 24-year-old Alyssa Burkett was lying in the parking lot where she had just arrived for work, shot in the head. She had been ambushed the moment she stepped out of her car. But one detail immediately stood out to investigators. Witnesses reported seeing the attacker flee the scene, and that attacker was wearing a fake beard, a disguise, in broad daylight, at a workplace parking lot. Why would someone need a disguise to kill Alyssa Burkett at 9 in the morning? Surveillance footage captured a large dark SUV speeding away from the scene within seconds of the attack. The driver knew exactly where the cameras were. The timing was precise. The escape route was planned. This wasn't a random act of violence. This was an execution. I'm going to show you how investigators unraveled one of the most calculated murder plots in recent Texas history. A plot that involved not one, but two people, elaborate planning, and a motive rooted in something as common as a custody dispute. The only reason investigators were able to piece together what really happened was because of cell phone location data. Data that would eventually prove someone was lying about where they were that morning. Data that would expose an alibi that seemed airtight. But this case is really about how far someone will go when they lose control. How obsession, manipulation, and rage can turn a custody battle into a murder conspiracy. How someone can convince another person to become a killer. This channel covers only real documented cases. Everything presented here is based on verified facts, court records, and official investigative documents. No fictional details, only the truth. To understand how Alyssa Burkett ended up in that parking lot, fighting for her life while a disguised attacker fled the scene, we need to rewind 2 years earlier, to when she first met the man who would orchestrate her death. Alyssa Nicole Burkett was 24 years old when her story came to a tragic end in a Carrollton parking lot. To everyone who knew her, she was a devoted mother, a dedicated worker, and a woman who had finally found the courage to walk away from a toxic relationship. She grew up in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, raised by her mother Teresa Collard, who described her as a bright, caring young woman with a contagious laugh. Alyssa loved children from an early age and often talked about becoming a mother herself. She was the kind of person who lit up a room when she walked in, friendly, warm-hearted, and fiercely loyal to those she loved. After high school, Alyssa began working in property management. She took a position at the Green Tree Apartments in Carrollton, a quiet suburban complex surrounded by trees and winding driveways. Her coworkers remembered her as dependable, always arriving early to open the leasing office, always willing to cover a shift or help a resident with a problem. She had a natural ability to make people feel at ease, and residents often requested her specifically when they needed assistance. But the most important role in her life was being a mother. In 2017, Alyssa gave birth to a daughter named Willow. The baby became her entire world. She worked hard to provide for her daughter, often picking up extra hours, and she would talk about Willow constantly, her first steps, her favorite toys, the way she laughed. Alyssa's social media was filled with pictures of the little girl, captioned with love and pride. Her friends said she was born to be a mother, and she was determined to give Willow the best life possible. Part of that determination meant leaving a relationship that had become unstable. For a time, Alyssa had been engaged to a man named Andrew Beard. They had met a few years earlier, and at first the relationship seemed promising. Andrew was charismatic, attentive, and eager to build a family. They became engaged, and Willow was born. But as time passed, the dynamic began to shift in troubling ways. Andrew's behavior became controlling. He wanted to know where Alyssa was at all times, who she was with, what she was doing. He monitored her phone, questioned her friendships, and grew angry when she spent time with anyone else. Alyssa's friends noticed she seemed more anxious, more withdrawn. She confided in her mother that Andrew had a temper, that he would become upset over small things, and that she felt like she was walking on eggshells around him. The relationship reached a breaking point. In early 2018, Alyssa made the difficult decision to end the engagement. She took Willow and moved out, determined to start fresh. She filed for custody and child support, hoping to create a stable, peaceful life for her daughter. On the surface, she appeared to succeed. She moved into a small apartment, continued working at Greentree, and began rebuilding her life. Her coworkers noticed she seemed lighter, happier. She was making plans for the future. Holidays with Willow, a possible move to a bigger place, dreams of watching her daughter grow up. To everyone around her, Alyssa was a young woman who had escaped a difficult situation and was moving forward. But beneath that calm surface, dark clouds were gathering. Andrew Beard did not accept the breakup. He did not accept losing control. And he would soon reveal just how far he was willing to go to maintain his grip on Alyssa and their daughter. Beneath that calm appearance, there were signs that something was not entirely normal in Andrew Beard's life. To the outside world, Andrew appeared to be a regular working man. He had a job, a place to live, and he spoke publicly about wanting to be a good father to Willow. But those who knew him more closely recognized a pattern of behavior that was deeply troubling. Andrew had a history of volatility. His father, Andrew Beard Sr., later testified that his son had a temper that flared quickly and unpredictably. Friends said he could be charming one moment and harsh the next. He seemed to need constant reassurance and validation, especially in relationships. When he felt threatened or rejected, his response was not to grieve or move on, but to escalate. After Alyssa ended the engagement, Andrew did not let go quietly. He began to contact her repeatedly, sometimes through text messages, sometimes through mutual acquaintances. He wanted to know about her dating life, her schedule, her intentions with custody. He accused her of keeping Willow from him, even though he was often late on child support payments and sometimes missed visitation entirely. Alyssa's mother, Teresa, witnessed the growing tension. She recalled that Alyssa would often seem nervous after interacting with Andrew, that she would check her phone repeatedly, that she worried about running into him at the grocery store or the park. Alyssa began to keep her location private, asked friends not to post pictures of Willow online, and installed a security camera at her front door. But Andrew was not content to simply express his frustration. Evidence would later suggest he began to plan something far more sinister. In the months leading up to that October morning, Andrew started a new relationship with a woman named Holly and Elkins. Holly was younger, impressionable, and apparently devoted to Andrew. Friends would later describe her as someone who seemed desperate to please him, who would go along with whatever he suggested. Andrew began to share his grievances with Holly, how Alyssa had wronged him, how she was trying to take Willow away. He painted himself as the victim, and he convinced Holly that action needed to be taken. The warning signs were there, but they were hidden behind closed doors. Alyssa tried to obtain a protective order, but the legal system required more evidence of immediate threat. She told a friend that she felt like Andrew was watching her, that she had a bad feeling about him. She even mentioned, in a moment of dark humor, that if anything ever happened to her, people should look at Andrew first. It was a premonition that would prove prophetic. How did these worlds collide? Alyssa and Andrew first met through mutual friends around 2016. Andrew was outgoing, funny, and he pursued Alyssa with intensity. She was flattered by the attention, and soon they were spending all their time together. The relationship moved quickly. Within months, they were engaged. Alyssa became pregnant with Willow, and she believed she was building the family she had always wanted. At the time, Andrew presented himself as a devoted partner and future father. He talked about buying a house, about saving for college, about all the things they would do together as a family. But as the pregnancy progressed, the cracks began to show. Andrew's need for control grew. He didn't want Alyssa to spend time with her girlfriends, didn't want her to go out without him, didn't want her to have a life that didn't revolve around him. The arguments became more frequent. Alyssa's family noticed that she seemed stressed, that she was losing weight, that she looked tired all the time. After Willow was born, the tension only increased. Andrew wanted to be the center of Alyssa's attention, but now she had a newborn who demanded her time and energy. He resented the division of her focus. He began to accuse her of prioritizing the baby over him. He would become upset, pick fights, and then apologize with grand gestures that never lasted. In early 2018, Alyssa finally decided she'd had enough. She ended the engagement and moved out with Willow. Andrew was furious. He refused to accept the breakup. He told friends that Alyssa had taken everything from him, that she was turning Willow against him, that he would make her regret what she had done. Around this time, Andrew met Holly Elkins. Their relationship began online or through a mutual connection, and it quickly became intense. Andrew confided in Holly about his legal battles with Alyssa, about his anger and frustration. Holly, eager to please him, offered sympathy and support. She began to view Alyssa as the enemy, a woman who was hurting the man she loved. Over time, Andrew's conversations with Holly shifted from venting to something more calculated. He would mention how easy it would be to resolve the problem. He would talk about how much better life would be without Alyssa in the picture. Holly, instead of pulling away, leaned in closer. The triangle was complete. Alyssa, the victim; Andrew, the mastermind; Holly, the willing accomplice. Everything changed on the night Andrew Beard realized he was losing the custody battle. Throughout the summer of 2018, the court proceedings had been ongoing. Alyssa was seeking primary custody of Willow, along with child support. Andrew was fighting back, but the evidence was stacked against him. He had missed payments, he had been uncooperative with visitation schedules, and there were documented instances of threatening behavior. Alyssa's lawyer was confident. She told Alyssa that the case was going well, that the judge was likely to rule in her favor. Alyssa began to make plans for a future without Andrew's interference. She talked about enrolling Willow in preschool, about moving to a safer neighborhood, about finally cutting the last ties that bound her to Andrew. Andrew heard the same assessment from his own lawyer. He was going to lose custody. He was going to lose regular access to Willow, and he was going to have to pay child support every month. Money he felt he shouldn't have to give. The rejection, the final legal confirmation that he had lost control, was more than he could tolerate. In the weeks leading up to October 2nd, Andrew began to escalate his conversations with Holly. According to later testimony, he told her that Alyssa needed to disappear. He talked about how it would be easier if she was simply gone. And he began to plan what prosecutors would later describe as a calculated conspiracy. Andrew was the architect. He chose the location, Alyssa's workplace, where she arrived at the same time every day. He chose the method, a firearm, quick and definitive. He chose the disguise, a fake beard and dark clothing, so that no one would recognize who was responsible. And he chose the person to carry it out, Holly Elkins. He convinced Holly that this was the only way, that Alyssa was standing in the way of their happiness, that she would destroy Willow's life, that they could be together, raise Willow themselves, and build the life they wanted. Holly, desperate for his approval and convinced by his manipulation, agreed to participate in an unthinkable act. The ignition moment was not a dramatic confrontation. It was a quiet, deliberate decision made inside Andrew Beard's mind. And once that decision was made, the course was set. There would be no turning back. On October 2nd, 2018, Alyssa Burkett woke up in her apartment in Carrollton. She got Willow ready for daycare, dropped her off, and headed to work. She was running slightly behind schedule, but not unusually so. Around 8:45 in the morning, she sent a text message to a friend, a routine check-in. She seemed normal, maybe a little tired, but looking forward to the day ahead. At 9 o'clock, she arrived at the Green Tree Apartments leasing office. She parked her car in the spot she usually used, a space on the left side of the lot, close to the entrance. She gathered her belongings, opened her door, and stepped out into the crisp October morning. That was the last normal moment of her life. At 9:15, a large dark SUV entered the parking lot. It circled slowly, deliberately, then stopped near Alyssa's car. A figure stepped out, dressed in dark clothing, wearing a fake beard and a hat pulled low. The figure approached Alyssa as she stood by her car door, keys in hand. A witness later reported hearing a voice, maybe a greeting, maybe a startled sound. Then the sound of gunfire, multiple rapid shots that shattered the quiet morning. Alyssa went down. The figure stood there for a moment, then turned and ran back to the SUV, which sped out of the lot within seconds. The entire incident took less than a minute. A coworker inside the office heard the noise and looked outside. She saw Alyssa on the ground, motionless. She screamed for help. Someone dialed 911 immediately. At 9:17, emergency dispatchers received the call. Paramedics arrived at 9:23. Alyssa was rushed to the hospital, but the injuries were too severe. She passed away at 10:15 that morning. The last confirmed sighting of Alyssa Burkett was at 9:15, standing beside her car in the parking lot where she worked. The last confirmed trace of the person responsible was a dark SUV fleeing westbound on the access road, disappearing into traffic. From the moment the SUV left the parking lot, the case entered a critical void. The person responsible had vanished. The disguise made identification almost impossible from the initial witness descriptions. The license plate of the SUV was partially obscured or not captured clearly on the available cameras. There was no immediate indication of who had carried out the attack. But there was one person who instantly became the focus of the investigation: Andrew Beard. Detectives arrived at the scene and began interviewing witnesses. Almost immediately, a coworker mentioned that Alyssa had been in a bitter custody dispute with her ex-fiancé. Another mentioned that she had expressed fear of him on multiple occasions. Within hours, Andrew Beard was considered a person of interest. The problem was that Andrew had an alibi. He told police that he was at work that morning, at his job in a warehouse about 20 miles away. He said he had clocked in at 8 o'clock and had not left the premises. He provided the names of co-workers who could vouch for him. He seemed cooperative, even appropriately concerned about what had happened to Alyssa. On the surface, the investigation seemed to hit a wall. If Andrew was at work, how could he have been involved? And who else would want to harm a 24-year-old mother who worked in property management? But investigators noticed something unusual. Andrew was a little too composed. He didn't ask many questions about who might have done this. He didn't express shock or overwhelming grief. He seemed almost like he was waiting for the interview to end, like he was going through the motions. And then, a small piece of information emerged. A witness mentioned seeing Andrew's car near the apartment complex in the days before the incident. Another witness reported hearing Andrew make threatening remarks about Alyssa. The gaps in his alibi began to form, small cracks that would soon widen. But the biggest break came from the surveillance footage. Cameras had captured the SUV leaving the scene. It was a black Nissan Murano. Investigators ran the vehicle registration. The car belonged to Holly Elkins. Suddenly, the picture began to shift. This wasn't just about Andrew. There was someone else involved. When authorities were first alerted, investigators initially treated the case as a possible random act of violence. But the evidence quickly pointed in a very different direction. Detectives from the Carrollton Police Department began a systematic investigation. They collected surveillance footage from surrounding businesses, residential cameras, and traffic light cameras. They traced the path of the black Nissan Murano frame by frame. The SUV was seen leaving the Greentree Apartments at 9:16. It drove west on Beltline Road, then turned onto a side street. It was captured by a gas station camera at 9:22, where it stopped for approximately 2 minutes. Then it continued to an address connected to Holly Elkins. Police obtained a search warrant for Holly's residence. Inside, they found dark clothing that matched witness descriptions. They found a receipt for a fake beard purchased 2 days earlier at a costume shop in Dallas. And they found Holly Elkins herself, who initially denied any involvement whatsoever. But when confronted with the surveillance evidence, with the receipt, with the timeline that placed her vehicle at the scene, Holly's story began to crumble. She admitted that she had driven to the apartment complex that morning. She admitted that she had worn a disguise. And then, after hours of interrogation, she admitted that she had been the one who pulled the trigger. But she insisted she had not acted alone. Holly told detectives that Andrew Beard had orchestrated the entire plan. He had pressured her for weeks, convincing her that Alyssa was a threat to Willow and to their future together. He had provided the weapon, driven her to the location, instructed her on what to do, and coached her on how to avoid detection. She painted herself as a victim of manipulation, someone who had been coerced into committing an unthinkable act. With Holly's confession, the investigation turned its full attention toward Andrew Beard. At first, the explanation provided by Andrew Beard seemed consistent with the available facts. He had an alibi, he had witnesses, and he had no obvious physical link to the crime scene. However, investigators later discovered evidence that completely contradicted this account. Digital forensics became the key that unlocked the truth. Andrew's cell phone was seized under warrant, and analysts began reconstructing his location data for the morning of October 2nd. The phone's GPS showed that Andrew had left his workplace around 8:30 and traveled to the area near the Green Tree Apartments. He had been present within a half-mile radius at the exact time of the incident. Furthermore, his phone had communicated with Holly's phone repeatedly in the minutes leading up to the attack. There were calls, text messages, and data exchanges that established clear coordination between the two. When confronted with this evidence, Andrew's co-workers began changing their stories. Some admitted they had covered for him, fearing his temper and the consequences of telling the truth. Others said they had simply assumed he was at work because his car was parked in the lot, but they had not actually seen him physically present after 8 o'clock that morning. The alibi collapsed completely. Andrew Beard was arrested and charged with conspiracy, kidnapping resulting in death, and stalking. The federal charges carried severe penalties, including the possibility of spending decades behind bars. Based on the evidence gathered by investigators, the full sequence of events was painstakingly reconstructed. In the weeks before that October morning, Andrew Beard and Holly Elkins met multiple times to plan the attack. Andrew purchased the weapon used in the incident, a 9mm handgun, through an unlicensed seller to avoid creating a paper trail. Holly bought the disguise materials at a costume store in Dallas, paying in cash to avoid leaving a credit card record. On the morning of October 2nd, Andrew and Holly drove together in the black Nissan Murano. Andrew was driving for part of the route, then switched seats to allow Holly to take the wheel. They arrived at the Green Tree Apartments parking lot shortly after 9 o'clock. They parked in a corner of the lot and waited until they saw Alyssa's car pull in. As Alyssa stepped out of her vehicle, Holly exited the SUV, wearing the fake beard and dark clothing. She approached Alyssa as she stood by her car door, raised the weapon, and fired multiple times. Alyssa went down instantly. Holly then ran back to the vehicle, and they fled the scene at high speed. Andrew dropped Holly off at her residence, instructed her to clean the weapon and dispose of the disguise, and then drove to his own workplace to establish his alibi. He returned to the warehouse, clocked back in, and acted as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't just orchestrated the taking of his ex-fiancée's life and left his daughter without a mother. But the digital trail left behind was undeniable. Phone locations, text messages, surveillance footage, purchase records. Each piece of evidence laid out the methodical planning and calculated execution of the conspiracy. The prosecution later argued that Andrew Beard had manipulated Holly Elkins into becoming his instrument of violence. He had preyed on her vulnerability, isolated her from other influences, and convinced her that what they were planning was justified and necessary. And when the evidence began mounting against them, he continued to deny everything, maintaining his innocence even as the walls closed in around him. The case revealed a chilling portrait of manipulation, control, and premeditation. This was not a crime of passion or a moment of rage. This was planned, deliberate, and carried out with the kind of cold calculation that leaves investigators shaken even years later. Holly Elkins pleaded guilty to reduced charges and agreed to cooperate fully with the prosecution against Andrew Beard. In exchange for her testimony, she received a sentence of 20 years in federal prison, with the possibility of supervised release after serving 85% of her term. Andrew Beard went to trial in 2023. The prosecution presented a comprehensive case built on surveillance footage, cell phone data, witness testimony, and Holly's detailed account of the conspiracy. The defense attempted to paint Holly as the sole actor, but the digital evidence made that narrative impossible to sustain. After deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. Andrew Beard was convicted on all counts: kidnapping resulting in death, stalking resulting in death, conspiracy, and use of a firearm in a crime of violence. He was sentenced to 43 years in federal prison. Because the federal system has no parole, he will serve the vast majority of his sentence behind bars, likely remaining incarcerated for the rest of his life. In her victim impact statement, Alyssa's mother Teresa Collard spoke directly to the court. Her voice trembled as she described the unbearable pain of losing her daughter in such a senseless way. She talked about Willow, who would grow up without her mother, who would never know the woman who loved her more than anything in the world. She described the moment she had to tell her granddaughter that mommy wasn't coming home. She asked the judge to deliver a sentence that reflected the severity of the crime and the irreplaceable loss her family had suffered. The courtroom was silent as Teresa spoke. Even the court officers seemed affected by her testimony. She ended by saying that while nothing could bring Alyssa back, she hoped the sentence would send a message that this kind of violence would not be tolerated, that leaving an abusive relationship should never result in a death sentence. Alyssa's friends and family have since established an organization in her memory, focused on supporting victims of domestic violence and helping women in difficult relationships find safe ways to leave. They have also become passionate advocates for stronger legal protections for parents in custody disputes who face threats from estranged partners. The organization has helped dozens of women obtain protective orders and find safe housing, turning tragedy into a force for positive change. This case serves as a sobering reminder that danger can come from the most unexpected places. Andrew Beard was not a stranger lurking in the shadows. He was someone Alyssa once loved, someone she trusted, someone she believed would be the father of her child and her partner in life. But when she found the courage to leave, his need for control transformed into something far more sinister. The fake beard found at the crime scene was a literal disguise, a physical mask worn to conceal identity. But the true disguise was the one Andrew wore every day. The mask of a normal, functional person, hiding a capacity for calculated revenge and manipulation. What makes this case particularly troubling is how ordinary it seemed from the outside. Custody dispute, child support payments, a breakup. These are things that happen every day across the country. Most of them resolve without violence. But in Andrew Beard's mind, losing control was unacceptable, and he was willing to destroy lives to maintain that control. Alyssa Burkett was 24 years old. She was a mother, a daughter, a friend, a coworker. She had plans and dreams and a future she was building. She loved her daughter fiercely and worked hard to provide a good life for her. She found the strength to leave a controlling relationship, which is one of the hardest things a person can do. She deserved to see Willow grow up, to celebrate birthdays and holidays, to watch her daughter graduate and build her own life. Instead, her story ended on a Tuesday morning in October, in a parking lot where she showed up to do her job, taken from this world by someone who claimed to love her but could not accept her independence. Her story lives on through the organization that bears her name, through the women who have been helped because of her tragedy, and through the continuing awareness of how domestic violence can escalate even after a relationship has ended. The most dangerous time for a victim of domestic abuse is often when they try to leave. Through this channel, we continue to remember Alyssa, to honor her memory, and to tell the stories of those who can no longer speak for themselves. We examine these cases not for entertainment, but to understand how these tragedies happen and how they might be prevented in the future. Thank you for taking the time to listen to Alyssa's story. If you or someone you know is in a controlling or abusive relationship, please reach out to the National Domestic Violence Hotline. Help is available. You are not alone. If you found this case examination worthwhile, please consider subscribing to this channel. Together, we can ensure that the voices of victims are never forgotten, and that their stories continue to matter and to make a difference. Rest in peace, Alyssa Burkett. Your light was extinguished far too soon, but your memory lives on, and your daughter will grow up knowing how deeply you loved her.